And welcome to another Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord Q&A. Our guest today is Guy Sengstock, who is not going to be unknown to many people here. He is the founder and creator of the Circling Method and the Circling Institute. He's been facilitating transformation for individuals, groups, and corporations for more than 20 years. He is a BFA from the San Francisco Art Institute and is the co-founder of the Arrête Center for Excellence and the Bay Area Men's Circle. He's an artist, philosopher, poet, body worker, and visionary. Thank you so much for being here, Guy.
Thank you.
So I'd like to, usually I start off by asking some introductory questions. So you are known as the creator of Circling. So I'd like to ask you two questions about this, and you can decide the order you want to answer them in.
Okay,
I'd like you to tell us what Circling is, but also what's the story of Circling? What led you to come up with it? How did what was the journey that brought you there?
Yeah. Well, if I can ask you, just so I can kind of tune into the listening a little bit more, like if I were to ask you the same question, what Circling is, based on what you do know or don't know, what would you say?
Sure. From my understanding, it's sort of I think of it as a meditative discussion where the parties are trying to communicate with each other, to really see into one another's, to really put themselves in the other's shoes, to understand not just what they're saying, but what they're feeling in the moment, in the moment that they're talking.
Yeah, totally. And why would you do such a thing if you would?
Well, for me, from what I've heard, and we've been introduced to the concept. So this is the Awakening from the Meaning Crisis Discord, which is based on John Vervaeke's work, and so a lot of us here have discovered Circling through John. And from what I understand, and I'm eager to experience that Circling can be transformative. My inkling from trying it a few times with some demos and hearing about it is that it will help put you in tune with other people in a way that you may not have been before, that you'll start to see things in other people, seeing their being mode, see them for who they are in a way, seeing things about them, characteristics about them, the moreness of them, so to speak, that you may not have noticed before, and then so interact with them in a way that you may not have been able to before without the practice.
Yeah. That sounds good to me. Everything that you just said. You keyed in on the quality of Circling. I think, it's funny. My answer to that question has been evolving, and I think it'll just continue to evolve because it's Circling for me, in the development of the Circling method, right, has been something that I felt like we discovered. But it wasn't like we were looking for something. We discovered it as an experience together, me and a group of friends, back, I think it was like late 90s, 1998, I think it was. And just spontaneously started having experiences together that were just profound, which I have been since then been asking myself the same question that Jerry, the guy who I started it with, asked me after it was all done, our first experience, and we got done, and it was 12 hours later, we had this experience of what we now call Circling happen, and he looked back to where we were and he pointed in that direction, and he didn't have a word for it. And I was like, yeah, and I pointed back at the same direction, and I didn't have a word for it. And it was this really beautiful kind of tongue-tied moment, but we both knew that we had just experienced something that was stood out as distinct from all the other profound experiencing things that we were having at that time. And then we just spontaneously put our hands out and just shook and committed to whatever that was. And I would say that I have been continually finding out what that is and been shaped by what that is in the finding it out. And I think that's just that process of leaning into some sense of intelligibility that's beyond me, yet draws me, and then in order to understand it, to bring words to it, I, on some level, in order to conform to it, it ends up transforming me. That's been my relationship with circling, and it's still going on, right? It's still happening right now as we're talking, as people ask me questions about it. There's still a sense of like, I often, to myself anyways, think about circling. I imagine circling as an entity sometimes, of like, and there's a sense in which she's still revealing herself to me. And when she does, I look different. My life looks different. How everything shows up for me looks different.
So how would you describe that transformative effect that people, that you experience and that you've seen other people experience?
Well, there's a lot of different components to it, right? But I think on some level, it's interesting because when we started this, right, when circling just started, there was a way where our vocabulary we didn't have the vocabulary to basically describe what we were talking about, right? Because I think that authenticity is really, in a lot of the ways of describing this kind of thing, have to do with like a normal notion of self, right? Of in some sense a sense of self-fulfillment or self-reflection, a reflected upon self, right, that I somehow own, right? But I think what circling really gets at is a deeper level of authenticity, which is how we, in so many ways, from the very beginning, right, like the very beginning, when we're like infants, right, we're born into a world, and how I become is through the attention and my family and contact and attunement with other people. How I know that I am, how I'm shaped, how I'm disclosed to myself is so deeply entwined with my environment, with and all the stuff, all the research that they're doing on attachment theory is like, really recognizing this, of like, there's a certain amount of distance from the mother's face that if the infant doesn't have, there's all kinds of symptoms. So I think it's like, if we just look at relationship, being ourselves in relationship, they're almost indistinguishable from each other. And I would say that like that's pretty well known in like psychology, right, for the most part. But I don't think we have much of a way of knowing how that continues through our whole lives, right? That we're constantly coming into being through our relationships. And so circling, you could say, is the transformation has to do with what's just so native soil to being a self on some level, right? Which is coming into conversations and having relationships that are mutually self-disclosing, right? In a way that inspires us and calls us beyond ourselves. That's what's possible in interactions. Now, I think that the fact that there's something called circling, right, announces that that's not how relationships usually go, right? Like, right, like they don't usually go that way, but they could. And so circling is all about like, if there were postures that you sit in, if there were muscles that you exercise, if there was an underlying logos, right, that gave rise to allowing relationships to open in that way together. Circling is like abstracted that out and made it a yoga.
So you, on your website, you describe yourself as someone who pays attention in such a way that will allow the parties, allow you and I to see and hear those things which have always been present yet never occurred to you.
Uh-huh.
Is this a skill that, do you think this is a skill you've always had, that's innate, that you were just born with, or is this something that can be cultivated in people?
What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? What do you think? And what are you kind of getting from what I'm saying so far?
Well, my guess is that I think that well, certain people probably are more naturally tuned into other people as well, but I think that it is something that everyone can work on and get better at, and through practices like circling.
Right. Totally. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's like, I mean, I think personally, I probably have a particular acuity for this. This is why it spoke to me so much. However, I have to say, at least from my own experience, I'm so much better at it than I was when we first started. Right. So it has me think that it is, and also from what I've just seen from teaching people for the last 20 years in becoming good circlers, right? Is it's interesting because your question kind of points to something that's I think really quite deep, right? Where it's always a paradox in teaching this, right? Because there are skills and there are ways of saying things. There's things to pay attention to. There's certain kind of, like, you could say, best practices for ways of communicating and attitudes and all that kind of stuff, right? But when it comes down to it, I don't think relationship is a skill. I don't think, I think it's a capacity, right? It's a
Mm.
capacity to be related. So it's, in fact, it's strange when somebody has a bunch of those skills, but they don't have any capacity to be in relationship, and they use all the communication techniques and stuff like that. It ends up just feeling really wonky. So I think it's like that starts to speak to where I think circling and learning how to circle and what it starts to get at when people talk about being transformed, right? Um, I think the transformation that they're probably speaking of is that there's that circling kind of, in a certain sense, demands, right, calls forth to you aspiring to coming into full contact with another person, right, deepening your capacity to be related. And that's really a being mode, I think, as Fromme would point out, right? It's not a having mode. So it's really tricky. There's like and this is where it's kind of, most people that, if you've ever experienced circling, it's like filled with these weird paradoxes, right? It's like, it's almost like when you go to a circling thing and you hear people describe it, you think you're talking about, like, you're talking about mysticism or something. And it is in that way, right? Because it's like right on this mode of like where I can become a better communicator, right? However, in becoming a better communicator, right, I must be able to deepen my capacity to communicate, right?
Mm.
and and I think that that's where you start to look at like development, right? You start to use terms like transformation, development, right? The becoming someone who could be good at that. So I think that's where, when people talk about like deep transformative experiences, I think it starts, that's that you start to, I think that's one way of starting to get at it. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that's excellent. One way that you put it on your website that was intriguing to me is you said, I'm someone who can sit next to a stranger and have a conversation with them such that the stranger walks away living inside a completely different world.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. You know, and I think like what I've been thinking about like recently is, I think one of the things that circling, I think one of the things that circling really, really, really does, a virtue that that underlines circling and is a practice of, is reverence, right? Because I think it's, and just like with the virtue, like the way Socrates and Platon, like the Platonists, talk about a virtue, it's like a virtue is like, at one level, it's like something that's already innately there, but it's also something that you can strive towards. And when I think when it comes down to it, I think everything falls, right? Those kinds of deep connections with people falls on your ability to find yourself in reverence of with another person, and to cultivate that sense of reverence. And I think that, like, when it comes down to it, it's the reverence that I experience and have cultivated through practicing it that naturally flows into, like, someone kind of listening to me, or somebody who's circling, and go, oh, they're a really good listener. like, yes, we're a really good listener, but I think all of that is expressions of the ability to continually be in, like, have the capacity to be in reverence. And I think that's really, when it comes down to it, as an exercise, if circling was cultivating something, I think it's cultivating that at the deepest level. And so, like, a lot of the time, people end up with this experience of what like reverence leads to, which are these experiences of awe, because reverence is predicated on this awareness of my own limitations, and that there's something beyond me that is something that I could never fully understand, right? That's that attunement to reality in such a way, and attuning to people in that way of that deep respect and reverence, I think, is what is the, you'd say, the machinery of that, I think, is what circling really does cultivate in a big way.
That's excellent. So I'd like to open up this to questions. If you could, for the audio, and say your name at the beginning of the question. It can be your Discord name, doesn't have to be your real name. But who has a question for Guy? Don't be shy.
I will. I'll throw out a question if I could.
Yeah, go ahead, Mike.
Great.
Hello, Guy. Thanks for coming here and doing this.
You bet. Nice to meet you, Mike.
Nice to meet you. So I'm curious. I've really enjoyed a lot of the conversations that I've seen you give, and I'm definitely enjoying this offer that you're providing for us here now. And I'm just curious. So I don't know exactly. I'm admittedly feeling as though it's a struggle to get the question out.
Sorry, I think we lost you for a bit there, Mike. Can you just start over? Sorry.
Oh, so sorry. Can you hear me now? I've been noting my sound has been cutting in and out, so it might be my.
Oh, yeah, you're cutting out again.
Can I?
Yeah, you're cutting in and out.
Oops.
I'm going to pass because I'm thinking I'm having.
All right, you know what? If you'd like, you could type it into the event listening party text, and I'll read it out.
Oh, okay, sure. I'll do that.
Great. Who else has a question?
Or a question, or I just love to get to know you guys and just hear what you're hearing and what's on your mind.
Sure.
Hey, I'm Mercury.
Mercury.
I actually sent you a message. I'd love to have you for a podcast on my channel. But for now, I'll start with, so this circling practice and the changes you find it makes in yourself, do you have any for how that's going to ripple out into society at this time, and to maybe tie it into the way the pandemic currently has created a unique opportunity for restructuring? And how do you see your expertise working into how we might move in a better direction as we begin to reactivate society?
I mean, that's a really good question. Well, first of all, so when I think about myself and my understanding of like things like society and culture and the world, I personally feel like, in some level, like I'm kind of an ant on top of riding on an elephant's back and I can only see an inch in front of me, right? So there's I just want to just presence, like, where I come from with that is, like, first of all, I actually don't even know what's going on, and I feel very humbled by all the changes. So I don't know exactly what's going on and what society needs, or even what society is. However, that being said, right, I think that there's one of the big dilemmas it seems that we're inside of, right, is I think actually Chris and John talked about this in a paper that they wrote. And I thought it was brilliant the way that they put it, where like we're in some kind of weird spot where we only recognize, right? We've only recognized like first person present and third position, right? And we've lost the sense of the other, right? And precisely, in other words, like all, and you can see it in all of like the kind of, you know, the identity politics and, you know, all that stuff, right? Where people are becoming more and more identified with a label or their group or their gender or whatever it is, right? And we've lost contact with the sensibility that one becomes who one is in and through dialogue and through relationship, right? The transformative power of that, right? And if you lose that spoke in the wheel, all you're left with is kind of warring games, right? And all the things that come along with this. So I think it's like circling happens to just really speak to a way of restoring the recognition of the other at a very simple level, right? To really kind of look at somebody and begin to see see them as distinct from your view of them, and begin to open up and begin to listen to them beyond what you could already think by yourself. I think that's an ancient value. I think that goes way back, and I think it is strikingly gone right now, like in the normal discourse, like the governmental discourse, and it's really scary on that respect. I also think it has something to do with like being in the age of technology from the Heidegger sense of the word, right? That I do also think that we are in a time that we particularly don't understand, right? Which is what is, you know, if we look at how technology has mitigated so much of our communication, and I think it's a profound change that I think we're going to look back on and go, whoa, this was like a huge thing that just happened, right? Where we started to separate. When I need to relate to you, I can actually I can text you, I can email you, I can do all these things to relay information to you without having to go through the awkward experience that it is of being with another person in communication and tolerating that ambiguity. There's so many different ways that we don't have to do that anymore. And of course, like all other technologies, like all other innovations, like it will allow us, we will naturally move towards what's easiest, right? And not towards what's hard. And I think that when we've, like with the answering machine, where I think was where it first started, right, was where I can, like, when I have a communication for you, I can actually don't have to go through the conversational, you know, relating that happens. And that level of conversing is how we become who we are. So I think there's also another part of it, which is why something like circling even makes sense, right, in this time, speaks to the time. Because on one level, I think circling, that there's such a thing as like a yoga for inner subjectivity, is such a strange thing, right? And but it makes sense that if we've eliminated so much of that, right, in our culture, to come and have to do like a yoga, right, and concentrate just like a gym is for our bodies, like going in and doing exercises of relating, is something that's only emerged in the last 20 years. But I think it speaks to that. So I think I think circling as a practice points to developing capacities that are probably central to what's going to have us move forward.
Excellent. Mike has posted his question. I'm struggling to ask. I'm struggling to ask the question because I feel it's a bit of a weighted question. But I'm curious if you consider circling a form of spiritual practice, and if so, or if not, why? And thank you for your response.
Hmm. Let's see. Let me just think about that for a second. Well, I think there's a couple things. Like, so for me, it's been a spiritual practice through the experience of it. I think as a practice, though, that it hasn't been um, explicitly spiritual, I think has been very, very useful for it, right? Because there's a way, because it's like it's a practice, right? There's not stuff that you have to believe about it, right? So it's not propositional in that way. However, it seems to afford a kind of spirituality or a waking up to a spirituality through people's experience, and in some ways, um, as John's pointed out, one of the things he noticed is that, he goes to a circling group and everyone's, using this kind of mystical spiritual language, right? And I think that points to what it affords. But I think part of why it affords that is because it doesn't presuppose spirituality. So yet everyone who gets really involved in circling, all of them basically, I think most of them would probably say, if you asked them, like, is this a spiritual practice? I think that for them, that they said, yes, it would be. It definitely engages the machinery, right? To use John's language, that is the very much the same machinery that makes room for spiritual experiences and feelings of connectedness and all of that stuff, like cognitively, emotionally, in an embodied way. So I hope that answers. Did that answer your question?
Very much. I'm hoping you might be able to hear me and I don't cut out.
Yeah, I can hear you.
I do feel as though I thought you gave a really wonderful example in sort of pointing out very much how I'm feeling with regard to like how do we, on the one hand, it sounds to me as though you're expressing yes, or you did. I heard an affirmation on your part of expressing yes, there is for yourself this spiritual practice that's going along, but at the same time, on what seems as though a very social level, in light of kind of the much larger worldly global context that we're in, it's as if, to me, we're at a mode of being challenged on how to actually speak about that.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of an in-between state. And so I feel is like the answer that you provided is in many respects a lot of examples that I feel I've had with some conversations with the people here, in that, like, we're talking about it and yet we're not talking about it, and what does this mean, and trying to figure that out. And so that meant a lot. Thank you for your response, because it's kind of helping me to formulate my own ideas and thoughts on it.
Right. I'm glad to hear that. I mean, it's like a worthy inquiry and wrestling match to be in right now, right? Because it's like and I think a lot of it has to do with our relationship to proposition, right? Like, I think where precisely it gets spiritual for me, or where I have spiritual experiences, is, there is that sense in which you're with somebody, right? When you look at another's face, for example, and you get really present, and you start to hear about their lives, right? And you really start to listen, and there's that mutual disclosure that starts to happen. There's a way in which there's you, right? And kind of like, you could say, something essential about you, or your suchness, your individuality starts to reveal itself to me, but through more of a kind of a cognitive feeling, right? It's like, in some way, in some way it's an encounter that is transcendent in itself. But there's also this other way where, like, in seeing who you are, there's also a way that that also opens up to something much greater, right? It's one of the things I've noticed with circling is that, somebody will open up about something really personal to them, and they'll take a risk, and will share something that that's hard for them to share, right? And in sharing it, who they are is revealed, right? Beyond the content of what they shared, like the courage or whatever it is that's like, that one is hit with. That sense of being moved by someone like that is simultaneously points to something about existence, right? That we can easily start to talk about, well, what is it to be moved? What is it that's moving us, right? Like, what is it what makes it worth courage, right? For the sake of what? And these start to get into these very deeply philosophical, mystical, spiritual distinctions that start to open up. And that's one of the cool things about it, is that where the sense of the suchness of the person, or the essence of the person, and the sense of inexhaustible intelligibility becomes figure ground. And at some point with circling, there can be this back and forth where the figure ground starts to interpenetrate each other. And I think actually those kinds of deep conversations, those kinds of deep forms of intimacy, are one of the few places that people can experience something beyond the secular, but in an experiential, unarguable way. I think it's one of the places where being can still be disclosed to us in the way that it can historically has been through, like, the church and all that stuff. So I think that it's a really deep question. It's a deep inquiry, and it only touches on everything.
Yes, 100%. I love the fact that you were describing what sounded to me as a genuine attempt. Like, there seems as though there's a point in which you're starting to recognize that there's something more in that experience that you're having with that other person. And then what's coming to my thought is kind of, there's this attuning that you're noting within your being, kind of thing.
Yeah.
Like you actually note kind of a sound or a tone or something like that. And so you're trying to connect more with that sound. And the more that you try to do that, the sound becomes even more resonant and more harmonic, and it becomes an even fuller sound, and it makes a greater desire on your being to want to share with that even more so. Does that make sense?
Oh, it does make sense. And then there's the experience of tuning into that sound, in it disclosing itself more to me, allowing me to recognize it more. Right. At some point, I start to realize I have become someone who could hear that sound. Right.
Yes.
And that there's a mutual disclosure. Right.
Exactly.
And I think the I thou, the basic fundamental unit of relating, is that's possible. Right. And I think circling that, like, in dialogos and all the things that we've been talking about, I think is one of the primary, if not the biggest, access point to that kind of spirituality, for lack of a better word, that becomes available to us, right? It's a full participatory thing, right? It's like I know, like, knowing you is a participatory event. I'm a community project, right? It's like, I cannot know in a relationship. I cannot know you without being known, right? I cannot hear you without being someone who can, right? And so tuning into to that mutual self-disclosure, that back and forth, what starts to get revealed is something, the greater or deeper horizons that we recognize that is already always the case, that is in fact having the conversation.
Right. Yeah. Thank you so much. you did you responded exactly where I was hoping. So thank you again, and
Sweet.
thank you for your time again.
Yeah, thanks for pointing out the music. I'm hearing it more.
Okay.
So, Socratic skeptic Dave has posted a question. Guy, thanks for your YouTube channel. Have enjoyed many of your videos. I'm close to developing a campfire space at the bottom of my garden in our allotment. I want to do some kind of men's group. Do you have one piece of advice for a beginner at hosting these?
One piece of advice. Wow. Well, I mean, so much of this work I developed around fires at the beach in San Francisco, like with a group of men. There's something really, really ancient about that. I mean, I think the biggest piece of advice is just doing it and showing up for it. And setting the context, right, for what's possible and what you want to occur, setting, and then just showing up, and then follow the movement of what shows, right? As Heidegger would say, follow the movement of showing. I think that's most of it. If you just set like time, space, invite the people, set your intentions, and then let the games begin, and then find what you're doing together, right? And I would also say that that be an example, be the happening that you want to have happen there. So lead with your vulnerability, like share in the way that you want to see other people share. Kind of really do it and lead it from the being mode. I don't think you can go wrong with that. And then afterwards, make it part of it. Have people tune into what actually does, what glowed and what doesn't, and then make that explicit amongst the group of yeah, when we did that seemed to really like zero in onto something, and you go, okay, well, what was that like, and start to look at it, like start to tune into the music, as you were saying, so we can start to hear the music, so it becomes the process itself starts to facilitate the thing that you want it to facilitate, but more of a midwifing process, listening to it.
Oh, thanks, Guy. That's some thoughts for reflection on, for sure.
Yeah. But I think just having the courage to put something like that on and responding to it wholeheartedly with your whole being, and just being the context that you want the content to arise inside of is the key.
Hey, Guy. Thanks for coming and doing this.
Hey, no sweat.
This is Tyler.
Hey, Tyler.
So, midwifing, that's such a great term. Something we've been playing around with lately, trying to notice in this conversational space, is the kind of the essence of masculine and feminine energy, and when it is that people are trying to seize control or commit to a position or hold fast, and when the space opens up, and when people relent, and when connections are made. And I think what I've really noticed is that so much of this is typically expressed in deep primal relationships between men and women, between the masculine and the feminine, as expressed in that sense, and the way that that's related to the types of bonds that we seek, and the deep compensatory aspect of the masculine and the feminine. And I wonder if there's some quality to a different ratio of men and women in a group that has some effect on it, or if there's some aspect to evoking that in the presence of more men or more women who may not necessarily naturally come forward with that aspect of themselves.
Yeah. Now, specifically, the aspect of themselves that you're talking about, do you mean the feminine, something like the feminine coming out in men, or the masculine coming out in women?
Right, yeah. Very Jungian kind of animus thing.
Totally. Well, it's funny. I mean, I don't know anything like I don't know anything for sure about this, but I can just like look to my experience of this. Is that it's always struck me that you know that um that when guys get together, they love to philosophize, right? Why is that? I and I think it's because actually it's one of the ways that we actually can experience something like birth or being pregnated with an idea or conceiving something in that way, right? That there's a way that it's like almost like like something about the domain of philosophy starts to get at ways in which like men can experience something like a birth, right? And that kind of energy. Um, and I've noticed like with my wife, for example, like I'm like, I spend all day with these questions that are burning in me and thinking about them and reading fucking books and having conversations. And like, I'm just doing that. My whole life's about that, right? On some level. And it is funny, like, there's just a sense with my wife, like that, where she'll be like, she totally gets it and she'll go there with me. But there's kind of a sense where she already is all that, right? That she's like she already is, she's so identified with life that like the sense of the mystery for me that's so compelling and all my attention goes there. She's kind of already the mystery, right? She's like, it's like embedded in her way of doing the dishes. And so I think there's a difference there, right? That at least that's my experience with that. But I think something about that there's something in terms of circling and about these practices relationally, that I think that there's something about listening and the deep sense of listening, right? Um, that I think Socrates always talked about is, listening as midwifery, right? Which is the kind of listening that I notice that I think that ultimately is very connected to reverence, right? And in that I think that in my experience, I don't know if you want to call that feminine or not, but like there's definitely a quality, a proactive quality of being able to hear not just what you're saying, but like who's saying it and like what isn't being said, and to start to orient around something being birthed that isn't fully there yet, right? And an emptying and a way of a deep silence in oneself that can call out to presence what's concealed, um, and reveal and call it into disclosure, right? And that is very much, I think, probably the closest thing that I ever personally get to something like a feminine experience.
Yeah.
Does that speak it out to
No,
your...
that's perfect. Yeah, I mean, I experience it very much the same way, and that's why I end up using those. Well, I use those terms, I think, just because I noticed so much of the resonance in various aspects of my own experience in the masculine and the feminine. Right. So I was there for the birth of my two children. I helped the midwives. I helped pull the children out, and there's something to that. Like there's the struggle. There's this masculine struggle, right? It's fierce. It's energetic, but then there's also this hush. There's this weight, this patient weight, and then all of a sudden there's something completely new, right? Like that moment when it comes out, when the newness, the novelty has arrived after that pregnant period. It's just so sweet, right? And that combination of the masculine and the feminine in that moment and the product of it, if you can, I think if you can elicit this in conversation, I think just as you said, it very much is like it's the procreative power in our minds, giving birth to the tensions and struggles, the pregnancies in there that we've carried with us for however long, right? And so that resonates deeply. Thanks.
Yeah, totally. I mean, you're bringing me back to my when Forrest was born, and my wife at that time. I'll never forget this. Like, there was this point where she was, the nurses had left and her water just broke, and they put her in the bathtub, and all of a sudden I went to go get something, and then I come back, and all of a sudden I hear this groan, like this moan, and I look over at her, and I was so struck by her, because it was so clear that she was experiencing a tremendous amount, like more pain than I could even imagine. Yet she was like, the moan was like where she was just kind of digging in and like completely being with it had such integrity that, and I looked at her and I was struck by the experience of otherness. I was like, whatever it is that she's doing, that level of integrity was almost like a pure kind of integrity of being with that pain, so with such solidarity and such like fullness or whatever it was. And I was just like, I had this sense of like, man, very few guys that I know would ever sign up for that. Right? Or could we know what we were signing up for? And it's interesting, kind of like in that sense of that they're just something so, and perhaps this is what the masculine, what the masculine does with the feminine is our love for them in some way kind of births out, right, in them, like when our consciousness is really, really centered and really clear, and in a certain sense we open our consciousness to them and we see them and we love them so deeply that on some level I think what happens is they birth into appearance, they birth into adornment, they glow and glisten, right? And the more that they glow and glisten, right, the more my consciousness has to expand in order for their appearance to fully blossom. So and it's interesting now to think about this, right? If I think about it now of like, well, what is it that's happening in like a conversation? My wife is just giving me the thumbs up and a heart thing on her chest. She's crying now. But if we look at that, like, okay, so well, what's happening with the love of an idea when a distinction or a something about a dynamic or an idea is being disclosed, right? Like if we say on some level that my listening is a giving birth to that, right? There is a certain kind of, like, it's funny, I think it really is, it's like this experience of being fully engaged in that way of giving birth. And it's just interesting to think about that. Like, I do think it's one of the ways that we get to experience that.
Yeah, absolutely.
My sister gave birth this morning. I just wanted to share that synchronicity. And I know it screws mythology up, but she's naming my nephew Odin.
Welcome, Odin.
So Churchfire Ethan has a question in text chat. Are you familiar with the International Institute of Restorative Practices? I took a course last year and they had an emphasis on a similar practice that they called circling to use in a classroom setting, but your name never came up. Is your method different from theirs? And are they taking your copyright?
Yeah, totally.
I added in the last bit about the copyright.
Right. Yeah. The I've never heard of them. Yeah, I've never heard of them, so I really can't answer that.
Well, I guess there are other institutes that do. There are other organizations that do claim to do circling. Do you consider circling proprietary? Do you mind if other people use the term if they're not in conjunction with you? Or you don't have to answer if you don't want to.
that's a whole left brain world right now. I'm contending with that a lot right now, and I think that the way that we're working at it, because it's been there's a whole set of distinctions around it, but we're basically kind of looking at a way to preserve circling, right, and in a way such that people know when they're getting it. And so, like, what organization and what way to do that is all what we're in the process of trying to do right now, because it's been like circling is spread like crazy, and on the other hand, circling is very difficult to do well. And so there's a way where I like that it spread so much, and then there's a way where I'm just hearing people call circling, like, to me, doesn't look at all sound anything like circling. So there's a sweet spot in there that we're working out.
Anything in particular that you'd like to point out that's the wrong way to do circling? Something like a common mistake made?
Yeah. Well, I think here's one of the things, right? And I think it's also a bigger issue. But I think I want to emphasize is that circling is not therapy. And I think that one of the things that really kind of troubles me a lot is when I hear people talk about, like, when I hear the word people talk about trauma and working with trauma and circling, and like these kind of mishmashing kind of therapeutic kinds of sensibilities in with it, it starts to really look like that's not what circling is, right? Circling isn't psychology. In fact, you could say that, like, circling is I think it's a philosophical phenomenological practice, right? Where it's more about the revealing of what is. And so I think the issue is that, like, a lot of times people find that really healing and they find it really therapeutic, but there's a real big difference between trying to do that or trying to invoke something like healing or therapy, and just doing the practice, right, and going into that space. So that's one of them. Is that when you're circling somebody, one of the big no-nos is kind of giving advice or trying to get something to happen. It's more like what we want to do is really open up to what is happening and seeing how close we can get to what's happening, and then notice what happens as we get closer to it. And there's other things too, like that, you don't want to give advice, right? You don't want to be fixing people. You don't want to be trying to heal therapy or correct people or kind of like impose your values onto somebody. It's all the things that what you want to do with circling is just deeply getting intimate with what is as it reveals itself to you.
Well, if I can bring a follow-up to that, I mean, if somebody is circling, and often what is in our heads is dealing with whatever stressors we have, or things like trauma or psychological issues that we have, that may be what somebody's feeling in the moment. How do you recommend? Do you recommend disclosing those things, not disclosing, or doing it? And how do you do it in a non-therapeutic way?
Well, it's interesting as we go. Well, here's the thing about it is that I think that like when you really be with something, it can be really therapeutic, right? So there's a sense of like, yeah, like as we go into it, we ask you like, well, what's going on with you, right? And then maybe one layer of it is the situation that you're thinking about, and then we just kind of get really present to what that situation means to you, right? And as we dive in there, right, you may hit some sadness, you may hit some grief, and we just keep welcoming whatever's there as it reveals itself to us, and how it reveals like what happens in the space between. I just posted on my channel a couple of videos back earlier this week. I just posted a pretty good videotaped circle as a demo circle that I did for the Art of Circling program, which is a year-long training that I do. It's a pretty well. Circling is difficult to catch on film, but this one does a pretty good job, and it's a pretty profound circle. And you can really get the sense of just kind of diving really, really deep in with this person, and just being with what is, and more of what is just started to disclose, and her whole life was in it, right?
I want to be respectful of your time. We're coming up to about an hour, and we started late. Are you okay to keep going? Did you want to?
Yeah, I can go. I can go for another probably 10 minutes or so.
Sure. Anyone else want to either ask a question or give an experience, interact in it in some way?
I kind of had a question that came up when we had a kind of mini demonstration here with people that had partaken in circling before. And there was some effect I noticed from one of the facilitators that, to me at least, felt like a kind of bending of the interpretation of a person's response towards a positive affect. And I'm assuming that this was kind of a way to create perhaps a certain feeling over what the practice was inducing. And one of the questions that came up is, in the practice of circling, is there kind of this orientation of, in some sense, trying to move away from our tendency to affect certain observations? Or is there this kind of perhaps more directed sense to it? You partially answered this in your last couple ones, but I wanted to kind of highlight that specific area.
I think the thing, well, let's see. Here's the thing about it, is that what we're talking about is like it's like a relational practice, right? So it's there's what's going on with you, and then there's what's like going on with me as it's happening, right? So there's a way where if the circle is structured where we're just circling one person and everyone's attention is on it, right? Really, the place that you want to come from is just really like seeing what's happening, and then getting as close to what's all there as humanly possible. You want to and this is what's interesting about it, right? Is it in relationship? We say that like the practice is like the practice of being with what is, or as I like to say, of dwelling in the question, how deeply can we and how profoundly can we be with what is? What is in relationship is like the moment I see it, the moment you bring language to it, it's disclosed, is also the moment that it somehow changes often, right? So there's an evolving disclosure that happens with it. And what we want to do is we want to tune into and be attuned by that, whatever that movement of disclosure is. And it's funny because it's interesting. I've noticed this with that I think one of the ways it gets, like, one of the things that kind of gets in the way of circling a lot of times is this very kind of atomistic sense about the present moment, right? Where there's a sense in which, right, if we just talk about what's here right now, right, as if the moment was a dot, right, and then the next moment is another dot or something like that, right? I think totally misses the ontology of how temporal we are through and through. So, for example, like what may be present for you is this tension in your shoulder, and that's the thing that you can sense and you can feel. But then if I go, okay, well, what's all involved in that tension, right? What we'll usually find is a whole future that I'm anticipating and bracing myself for. And like then what we find is, like, if we unfold that tension in your shoulder even more, what gets disclosed is like what has me anticipated maybe a whole history, right, that's
Right.
embedded in the concerns, in which is this current note is the tension in my shoulders. But just like music, I don't hear music by listening to each note atomistically. I only hear music precisely when the note points to the future and the past notes that just went on, and I can start to hear the melody, right?
Right.
That's it. That's the thing that we want to do, is revealing more of the music that's being played in a certain sense.
Right, and that's a beautiful description of the phenomenology that I was experiencing even within our little attempt to get a feel for it.
Yeah, totally.
Where in many ways it was by in some sense, hyper focusing on that moment, that it seemed to expand into almost a narrative unto itself. You could feel history.
Bingo.
Yeah.
Bingo.
Blossoming forth through that exact moment.
Bingo. Right. I was like, well, what else? What the hell else are we, other than a moment of the world disclosing itself through and as us, right? Like, so if you go deep enough into somebody's issue, if you just keep following that thread, eventually you're just going to hit God, right?
Right.
It's like, it's that, and I think that's where it starts to get mystical, and where it makes a lot of sense to describe circling in this kind of spiritual language, right? Is precisely, it's that quality of attentiveness to the phenomena of God, because when you think about it, it's so intense being human. I think about it like, actually, this is a good explication of this. When I was in art school, I graduated from the San Francisco Art Institute. I'm a painter and a sculptor, and I had this art teacher that was in a life drawing class that I had for a number of years in a row. So that he was really good, and it was so funny to hear him talk about the difficulty in capturing the human form. And what he used to say is like, it's so difficult to render either abstractly or expressively or literally, representationally, because there is not one part of the human form that isn't dynamic and expressive. And another way of saying that is that there's not 1 inch of us that isn't a communication, right? That everything is expressing. Like, for us, we are creatures of language, right? And we are constantly like emanating and imbued with levels and layers of intelligibility, most of which we're not even aware of, but all of it is a communication, right? So on some level, when you tune into a human being, I mean, the levels of complexity and depth of what you can begin to hear, if you really start to attune to the depth of what it really is to be a human being. And this is what's interesting, is like, I think I can only tune into the level, like the deepest level of your humanity. I could only tune into that with my own humanity, right?
Right.
And so that kind of quality, or that observation of like, yeah, the more we tune into this, the more there's almost like a narrative starts to unfold from itself, right? From the phenomena, like that. But if you think about like the way you stand as that unfolding happens, what you start to, all the micro instinctive movements in your nervous system that you make, the attuning in, the facial expressions, like how you stretch in certain ways, in becoming a part of all that, I think is the machinery, right, that affords us being open to the world in a radical way.
It's interesting, the image, or one point that kind of popped up in my head as you were describing there, was having a mystical experience in relation with others, and having this sense of almost those micro expressions, that deep connection to the thing, in some sense animating the object, actually started to blur, such that the object itself was likewise the expression underneath, or part of that thing that animates fundamentally. And in some sense, it felt like a deep blurring between the kind of ontological pursuit and the theological pursuit.
Yeah.
And I don't know, it's like it moved me out of a naive aesthetic frame. I have a helicopter in the background, sorry.
Mm-hmm.
It moved me out of that naive aesthetic sense of someone's physical existence as somehow representative of some aspect of beauty, and instead that sense of beauty seemed to be in the existence that was there at all. Like I don't have I don't have good language anymore, but
that was pretty damn good. And then how would you say the process of seeing that, right, and then redescribing it, like, what did that do to you, if it did anything? Who did you have to become in order to see that, right? What did that take on your behalf?
Well, it's interesting flipping it back inside, because it had such a deep kind of mirroring effect in that it likewise felt like I was experiencing myself as the object within the subject. See, I'm again losing my language.
Yeah. Well, notice, okay, so just like right there, notice cognitively the stretch that you're needing to make in order to describe this experience that you had.
Right.
That stretch, right, is precisely the practice, I think. Right?
I see.
This ability, like, for example, right there, just in that thing, okay, how do I describe something that's like both subject and object mirroring each other as it's happening? Like just feel all the different capacities you're trying to balance, and just in your cognition and describing that. Like, I think that's the thing that circling opens one to, right?
Right. And yeah, in that sense, there's this kind of deep realization that I can't actually capture the thing outside of existing itself.
Yes, and here's what's really interesting. This is where it starts to mirror into the Socratic dialogue, right? Where there's this paradox of the dialogues, where Socrates will like say, okay, what is this virtue? And then it's just that, like, the whole ride is this frustrating thing where you find out at the end, like, not even Socrates knows what the answer to that question is. Yet somehow at the end of the conversation, there's this openness that somehow the dialogue had reached a level of aporia that transcended the dialogue itself.
Right.
And that you started to the dialogue allowed us to begin to circle around and noticing a kind of disclosure of what was already the case, that we realized, in not being able to put into language, we realized that walking away from that, our vision is better, our listening is deeper. Is like, you want to send your sons to go spend time with Socrates. I think that is a possibility that's open in relationship and dialogue. That is, on one level, it's really, really old, but it's latent and it's possible. And I think it's that sensibility that even draws us to this dialogue that we're having right now. It's very exciting.
It is, yes. And thank you much. That was a wonderful bit of conversation. I'll open it back up.
Absolutely. Hey, I just got just to let you know, I just got a text, and my client is needing to cancel last minute, so I actually have time.
Oh, sure. We'll take it.
So I'm curious, what is the one who's hosting the meeting? What are you getting? What are you hearing? What's striking you?
Well, your talk about reverence was very interesting to me. Reverence is I think I have a discomfort with the concept of reverence. That maybe it strikes me from the religious aspect that it that it seems different from respect or appreciation. That reverence seems to be giving up something to the other side. So I found that interesting. I guess the way I sort of reconciled it in my head is it's reverence of the reverence of the communication between the two people, and that I think I can sign on for that. It's the communication itself we're revering.
Right. Yeah, the disclosure, the living disclosure that's happening, and the process that we're in. You can, as you imagine that, is it fair to say that you can feel whatever organ that reveres? You can feel that organ be able to open up to that.
Yeah, and exposing, I guess, opening yourself up to communication in the way that you haven't before, and valuing it for itself.
Right. Yeah. What is it like to think? Yeah, what is that like for you to just kind of think about that and ponder it? And
well, I know there's something exciting for me always in having a good conversation when you get into sort of a flow state, where you're say even an argument with somebody who you disagree with, but where you're really communicating, where you're really understanding one another, and maybe you come to some realization, or one of you realizes something in the other person's arguments, or vice versa, and there's an ecstatic feeling that I sometimes get in those kind of discussions. And that
what do you make of
like,
that ecstatic feeling? What do you make of that? What affords that, or what is it about? What does that say about conversation? That one of the things that lets you know that you're in one like that is that you can feel really ecstatic and in this flow state. I mean, what do you make of that?
Well, I think that we have there. Before I started the server, some of my work sort of on Twitter, my pet projects on Twitter was promoting productive discussions, and I would try, Twitter discussions, for example, are very unproductive and sort of garbage fiery, but I would have some good discussions with people, and they would say, you know what, this was the first time I've actually had a productive discussion. And there was a certain delight there, and I think people don't realize how rewarding it is to really communicate with somebody, and we get into these us versus them dichotomies, and we really get caught up in them, and it's hard to get rid of it. But once you do, even with when you have a great discussion with them, that brings them closer to us, and you understand them better, and there's something great about that. And I think there's an untapped desire, I think, that many people have, and they don't realize they have that desire until they have that experience, and they're like, wow, that was great. I don't have to fight.
Right. There's something inherently, is it fair to say that there's something innately when you have those conversations where that you're describing, it's like there's something encouraging about it, right?
Yes.
It's like it's one of those things of I noticed this about, like, I think it's on the same level of doing hallucinogens, right? Like, I always had this experience of, like, when I would do hallucinogen where I would start, like, it would start to come on and I'd feel the shift in my consciousness, and usually, like, my first thought would be, oh shit, it happened again. When I was thinking about dropping this acid or doing these mushrooms or whatever, like, I thought I was actually thinking about this. But now I remember, like, oh, I was not representing this at all. Now I remember this, right? There's a quality of like there's knowing it and then there's getting it, right? And this experience of, like, when you enter in that space, I've done, like, I don't know, I calculated at one point, I think I've led something like 8,000 circles, right, in my life. And whenever that thing happens, it's always like that. It's always like this existential, oh yeah, right? Like, there's something about it that cannot be represented, right? But it's a living idea. It's a living sense of what's possible becomes felt, and that
Yeah.
felt sense of possibility, I think, is the standing out that one feels, which is what ecstasy is, right? To stand out from while being in.
And I think until somebody's had it, they don't necessarily even know they want it when it comes to communicating
Right.
with other people.
Right. Totally. And here's the thing about it is, like, one of the things I've noticed is that I really do think that, like, listening does I see a lot of books on communication, right? And I see a lot of literature on it, right? As there ought to be. But usually what it's talking about are, like, it's usually talking about ways of talking, right? Ways of expressing yourself, ways of saying things. And I think one of the big things that kind of gets forgotten is that there is no speech without a listening, right? That ontologically, right, there's a sense in which it's hard to imagine, like, first they were speaking and then somebody listened. Well, what calls forth the speech, right? Unless there's a listener there. So this sense of listening is so deep to all of our communications, but it's one of the things that I don't hear much attention being given to it. But, like, if somebody, like, you could take the most closed person, and then you just start getting interested in what has them be so closed, right? What has them think the way that they think, and you lean into them, and you listen to them. You listen to the sense of them being a legitimate other. There is something that in people I've noticed that just innately responds to that, right? With self-disclosure. We're almost designed to do that, I think, on some level. So there's that. I think one of the things I've really appreciated about circling is this deep attunement and this focus on what is it to genuinely listen to someone? What is to genuinely, as Heidegger would say, maybe it's a good idea that we can hear things that are beyond what I already think. And because I think that there is what becomes possible in listening. John and I talked extensively about this a lot in our last video a few days ago. I really appreciated it. And it was this sense of, like, listening. When you think about what listening really is, I think people usually think of it as, like, well, listening is just being kind of an emptiness, right? That is filled up with words on some level. But that's not listening at all. Like, if you think about it, as I'm talking right now, especially, like, of the people listening to me, at some point you'll probably, throughout this conversation, you'll probably have, like, drifted and started thinking about something else. And then you notice, like, oh shit, like, you pop out of that thought and you realize you hadn't listened for the last minute. There's that reveals this very, very close relationship between thought and listening. That I can't listen and think at the same time. So there's this way in which, when I listen, right, in some way, in a certain sense, I'm allowing another to think a thought in me, right? That's kind of what listening is. Now, what's really interesting is that when you think about that, like, this is why I think, for me, I would have to say that I've just been so fortunate in this regard since a young age. I've just had people, older people, who have just taken me under their wing. And in some ways, they would speak to me on some innate level. Like, what made them mentors for me is that they knew that, like, for them to speak to me, that in order for me to listen, that something profound would be happening in that listening, that would be that spoke to who I was and spoke to who I could become. So there's this way, and I think probably everyone on this list probably has a bent towards both the spiritual but also the philosophical, the intellectual, right? And I would imagine we all know that experience of like grappling with the text, right? Or an author or somebody who thinks is saying something to you, but you can't, it's just outside of your ability to comprehend, but you're drawn towards it. So you're drawn into listening. Now there's some thoughts, in order for me to think them, I can't think them standing on my own like presuppositions. I need to actually, in order to think the thought that I can kind of sense is there's a lot there, I must, in some sense, stand on a different set of presuppositions in order to understand what you're saying. Like, that's where listening, and as you start to shift your presuppositions, you start to shift who you are, how you understand. And this is where I think listening can become really transformative. And in many ways, it's like I kind of feel like myself, like on some level, I feel like I'm my constituents. I'm constituted by all of the profound relationships and conversations I've ever had in my entire life, including the ones that went badly. I'm most fucked up by all the relationships that didn't go well, right?
So that issue of the mind wandering, do you have any tips for how you keep your attention focused on the other person, how you really take it in without losing it?
Yeah. Well, I think one of them is just to, like, first of all, it's just having that intention, like having the intention and being transparent to yourself with the intention of, like, I really want to hear you. I really want to get what you're saying. And then some practical ways of doing that is just simply kind of like exercises of just simple paraphrasing. Like, before you speak, like summarizing what you just heard, right? Like right now, like you wanted to, so you're what I'm hearing is that you have an eye on a practical matter that, like, it's not always easy to listen to people. So how do I begin to do that? What are some practical things that I can do to actually do that? Did I get it?
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. So one of the things I like about paraphrasing as an exercise is that it's similar to mimicry. I think it's a lot more profound than just repeating what you heard. It's actually, when you paraphrase somebody, you're actually, in a certain sense, becoming them and taking a walk with what they just said. And there's something that happens in that walk that, like, speaking it actually manually has you think what they just said out. And at the end of that thought, there's kind of a little sense of, like, oh, you just went on a ride. And then you can start to notice whatever you say next will be in direct relationship to what they just said. I think there's something about, there's like that, you can look at that as like an asana, right? Of, like, really making sure that you kind of repeat back what you heard before you say the next thing. That's one way of doing it.
Excellent. I don't want to be the focus of everything. Does anyone else want to jump in? And
yeah, in fact, like, I'd love to hear what you guys are hearing, what you're getting.
So
I have
at this
question. Oh, sorry.
well at the start of the conversation, I sensed an attempt at or an engendering of enthusiasm, and I sensed it again, but it wasn't really there in the middle of the conversation, apart from some genuine enthusiasm, I guess. But so is that something that you're trying to play with, like creating like an atmosphere for fertile relationship, or and do you have like strategies of relating to that?
Well, I think it's kind of like, I'm not sure if this is what you're asking, but I'll see if I can, if my answer, let me know if I answer the question that you're talking about. So, see, what I have to say, like, one of the things I've noticed, just in my own experience, is, like, my temperament is naturally not extroverted, right? I would have to say I'm, like, more on the introverted side. So I oftentimes, right, this is where it's so interesting, because in a certain sense, being committed to developing circling, that commitment has drawn me out to more relationship that I wouldn't have naturally preferred. So I think you guys all know this. Like, it's like where if you're in a bad mood and you don't feel like talking, but you have an appointment or something, or like there's like you committed to go to your friend's birthday party and you're feeling depressed or something like that. There's this kind of hump you have to get over. But then once you start to engage in the dialogue, or you go to the party, like there's at some point, like oftentimes what I found that happens at some point, I surrender my will, right, over to the ritual of the relationship or the conversation, and at some point I find it's become in the realm of the always already. I'm already always it caught into the flow of the conversation. I can't tell you how many times it's been. Well, here's the thing. It's like there's a you could look at conversations as like a ritual, right? And so like when you have commitments that have you go beyond your preferences, this is one of the big things about relationships I've noticed, is that in some sense, like just getting yourself in front of people and becoming involved, there's something about the economy of the conversation starts to catch, right? And I find myself like someone who's having the conversation, and I get into a flow. So I think we can show up to a conversation with that intention without necessarily having to feel like it, which is often the case for me.
Right. So that's really nice. So how do you decide what to do? Do you think like, do you have like experiential things, or are you like attuning to some kind of tone that you sense out there, or like?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's I would say that there's it's interesting. It's so interesting to think about this, because it's so imagine you're alone in a room, right, just by yourself, and then just bring like somebody in the room and just they're sitting in the corner. That's a completely different room, right? Like versus when you're alone, and then when there's someone else there, there's such an embodied, socially embedded, beyond ourselves thing that happens when we're around other people. So there's just the matter of just getting yourself involved, where there are things going on in your body and your social makeup that will just naturally be attuned and be attuned by that somebody else is there, right? So I think there's just natural machinery that just works on its own. So I think most of it is just showing up, and then the other part is just I would say really bringing my interest to what other people are saying and what the conversation is, and manually bringing my attention there. And at some point, as I bring my attention there, just kind of like with meditation, right? You bring your attention back, like when you start thinking, you lose contact with your breath, and in the moment you catch it, you just bring yourself back. I think it's something's very similar in being caught in a dialogue, right? Just bringing yourself back and showing up at some point, a dialogue, and especially really deep dialogues, right? In some sense, you become a self. Yourself becomes given by dialogue, and that's where we start to get into dialogos in a lot of these conversations that we've been talking about. But I think it's very similar to where you bring your attention, and so bring your attention to like your interest to who this person is and what they're saying, and like even if you don't feel like it, even if you don't feel the interest, right? Coming out of yourself and bringing your interest there, like, is a way of letting the process catch you. How's that?
No, that's great. Yeah, I'm I'm also playing with these things, and I'm trying to figure out some orientation. So it's always nice to hear other people explain their process.
Totally. Anyone else? What else are you guys hearing? How many people are here?
4, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 right now.
Oh, 21. Right on.
A question, but I've already spoken a lot, so I don't want to step on anyone else.
Well, I'm sure they'll scream if you start stepping, so just go ahead and start stepping.
Okay, I want to reverse the polarity of my first question where I asked about scaling up.
Yeah.
Instead, ask, do you have any thoughts on applying this to our own internal dialogue and how we interact with ourselves? Just also to say, you've talked a lot about what we can learn about ourselves and grow in relationship. Do you feel about self-development during extended periods of isolation?
Yeah. Well, I would say that, I mean, what you're pointing to is a real deep thing, right? You could almost say that we're always in a dialectic, right, of some kind with ourselves, with our environment. And like, even when we're thinking, we're thinking that thought has some sense of somebody who's hearing the thought, right? Or someone who's thinking. I think really it's arguable, but I would say that like it's safe to say that like we're a relationship all the way down. And I'm constantly talking to people in my head, right? Even when they're not there. Like, for example, this is a great example, I think, in Corey Anton's book, which I just uploaded another video on Corey Anton, who wrote a book called Selfhood and Authenticity, which is kind of an existential Heideggerian reassessment of the self, and then from that reassessment, what does that imply for authenticity? I love that guy. So we go deep into this. But one of the things he says in this book that I just thought was just hilarious and ironically funny was, imagine, you can imagine an artist who does the greatest masterpiece of his life. And then when he's done, he imagines other people seeing it and criticizing it. So he destroys the painting. The question is did he avoid the criticism? I think you got to answer no, he didn't, right? And that there's this way, and it starts to highlight that like I am social all the way through. Like even when I'm alone, right? There are embedded social practices in the way that the agent or an arena relationship show up is imbued with people, even if they didn't ever criticize me. That I destroyed the painting so that they wouldn't presupposes that I already was criticized by them, right? I didn't need them to criticize me. And so that just kind of gets at how deep it is. So I would say that like that we're always in dialogue, intimate dialogue with ourselves, and that there's a way of being. One of the ways of having reverence for yourself and respecting yourself is to give attention to that dialogue. And I know that like in working in my coaching practice and working with people, one of the biggest places that I think that we're really fused, right? The self is really fused is to the superego, right? Or that sense of that critical voice that often like its job is to kind of keep you the same, right? Which is really about your survival. And how it lives is this kind of this constant sense of criticism that comes up whenever you start to go beyond the shape you normally take. And I notice that like in when I'm working with people, coaching them, they start to set goals and they start to move towards who they aspire to be. And it inevitably brings up all that self-judgment and criticism. And so one of the big relationships that they start to get into is to start to see that that's happening. Oh, there's this structure in me that's like basically telling me what reality is and who you are and what I can and can't do and who am I to dare to even think I could do that. And all of that, like all of that that process. And so a big part of realizing and going to that next level of who they are is about having a real relationship with that for what it is and going into dialogue with it, right? Disengaging from it, like hearing the way that it talks to you and the way that you position yourself and fight with it and avoid it. And that's like an example of like seeing the dialogues that are always going on inside of ourselves. So yeah,
Roger Dawkins' subpersonality model. My partner on sorting myself out was mentored under Roger Strachan and Ryan Holsapple. He specializes in doing subpersonality. I would love to hear you have a conversation with someone, an expert on the subpersonality model, because I feel like a lot of what you talk about in circling, when you dissect yourself into a variety of subpersonalities, what they work people through seems very similar in a lot of ways to what you have people do with each other.
Totally. Yeah. I am like, even when I'm alone, I am only myself in relationship to another, right? Like it's kind of like ontologically, that's what a self is. It's always an agent and arena. It's a deep it's like in the structure of our being. So I think all those kind of techniques are really great that kind of work with subpersonalities and have you go into dialogue with them. It just seems to just make explicit what's already going on, right? So I think it can be really helpful to break that stuff up, right? And to, actually have each part of you complete a sentence with the other part, and you get into dialogue, and things just resolve just on their own. That same kind of moving to another level through, conversation basically with yourself. All things that facilitate that just seem like no brainer. That's good. And it's also, it's interesting too. Like, I think one of the ways that people often, encircling, well, if you notice, like if you get to know somebody, you start to, like everyone has rants that they get onto, right? Where you'd be talking to them and all of a sudden they're just like, they're addressing some concern that you didn't have with them about something, and they start to talk to somebody else. It's almost like they're taking one of these people in their head and then they're kind of putting it on you and then talking to you. And circling seems to bring that out a lot. Like where, like for example, I'll give one example of somebody I was working with for a long time where he came in and we started talking and I started to notice that he kept saying this particular sentence structure over and over again. He kept saying, he would say something and he would say, yeah, but it's cool, it's all right. And then he'd talk about something else, and at the end of it he'd say, it's cool, but it's okay, And I, after like counting about 30 times that he said that, I finally was like, can I ask you who you're talking to? And he's like, what do you mean? And I was like, well, you've reassured me that it's cool and it's okay like 30 times. And I never insinuated that it wasn't cool or okay. And all of a sudden he's like, he stops and his eyes get really big and he's like, who was I talking to? And then over the next year, we discover that actually who he was talking to, he had no idea, like his whole, like what happened in his childhood, and his parents were insane and his mother was hospitalized. And then he was like kind of holding his whole child. He was like the savior for everybody. And he had no real conceptualization of that or awareness of that. Yet that he would kind of index his world in terms of that history and then try to solve it. And so like that's an example of like where we actually and oftentimes in circling where people will be sharing or talking and people feel disconnected And oftentimes what starts to happen is we look at that, we go, it's like, okay, so what was happening in that moment? And oftentimes what will happen is people will realize like, oh, they weren't talking to us at all. They were assuming that like you guys didn't like me, and therefore I was kind of already kind of anticipating that and trying to please you, right? And it wasn't actually in connection to the people there. So like when you start to get into and examined like, well, when there's a loss of connection or the lack of connection, and then you highlight that and you get curious and like start to unpack that a bit, what you find are those kinds of internal relationships that we project out.
It's not about us. The person who flips you off on the street or whatever, that's often not about you at all. It's just you're not mad at me. You're still mad at your dad or whatever.
Yeah.
People often going around interacting with the world in such a way that they're just projecting their own things onto it and interacting with that.
Totally. Yeah, totally. Absolutely. Absolutely. It's kind of like one of the big openings, right? Talking about listening, to really listen to somebody in some sense is a teacher of mine that said, like, asked me, is like, okay, in order for listening to be available, right, to you, for genuine listening to happen, what do you have to understand about listening, such that if you don't understand this, listening is impossible, right? And we were in a he lived in an area that had like a town square with a park in the center of it, and we were like walking along, and I would give him, I don't know, some smart answer about it, and he's like, nope, and he'd give it another shot. And so we walked around the park like 3 times, and he's like, he stops me, he says, okay, you ready? He's like, what do you got to get about listening, such that if you don't get this, listening isn't possible? And he stops and he looks at me and he's like, you got to get that you don't listen. And all of a sudden it started to sink in. It's like, oh yeah, like what I have to get about listening is that I don't listen. Because if I can't hear that I don't listen, right, listening is impossible. But the moment I hear that I wasn't hearing you, that I was hearing my projection of you, or all my pre-listenings of you, all my judgments of you, or whatever, the moment I can begin to hear that is the moment genuine listening becomes possible. And I keep getting that on a deeper and deeper level myself. Like I always because I never think when I'm listening that I'm not listening. I always think that I'm listening when I'm listening. But then I'll start to hear like, oh shit, I actually wasn't hearing you. But I just heard that I wasn't hearing you is the moment I begin to hear you.
It's sort of like meditation when you realize your mind has wandered.
Very much like meditation. I think that's why circling oftentimes is referred to as an intersubjective meditation.
Anyone else want to share what they've taken from the conversation today?
Well, I wasn't actually going to say anything, but what was just said about not listening, that was very interesting to me. And I was wondering if there's any techniques for kind of helping other people have that realization that that they're not really, that they're listening to somebody who is not there, or that is in their head, rather than the person who's right in front of them trying to communicate with them.
Right. Well, I think it's one thing just on this end, I think back to just saying what you heard, right? So just having really, really saying, okay, this is what I heard, and telling them what you heard, and then finding out whether or not you heard them, right? Like, is that what they meant, right? And so that's one way, right, of just not assuming that I'm hearing you, but actually checking, right? Because I have to say that so many working with lots of couples and marriage counseling, most of the time when people are arguing, they are not arguing about the same thing, and they don't hear that. So a lot of the coaching is just having them start to hear what they're actually saying to each other, and then having them hear that they weren't hearing it. I mean, when it comes to somebody else, it's mostly I think you can ask them so what are you hearing? I just want to make sure that we're like, you're hearing what I'm saying, or I just want to get it, right? And you can invite them to speak it out, right? Where you make the listening, one is you unconceal listening, and you say you acknowledge there is a listening that could happen here, right? And it's kind of what this conversation is inside of, and it could happen in greater or lesser degrees, and attuning to the listening, and then bringing it up as part of the conversation. That's something that's really rare, but I think it's always valid to do.
I've got something to add here. This has been a recent epiphany of mine, the whole how to have a good conversation thing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm happy to share. I'm happy to pause. I tend to get into monologues, but I've learned recently how to stop doing that. So my point of view on this is roughly that the best way to have a good conversation is to shut the fuck up. I'm sorry for being blunt, but it's the truth. My father, unfortunately, he has a different problem. My brother has the problem of not being able to shut his mouth. My father, and these are both major triggers for my own hypomania. I'll leave it at that. But my father has a problem of not being able to hear. And it's not that his ears have problems, it's that his ears aren't open. Whereas I'm now all ears. I have nothing but ears. I don't even have eyes anymore. And with my father, what I noticed is a pattern that he's gotten into. He's built a gutter in his mind, a gutter that the bowling ball just wants to fall into. And the more that you build through this gutter, you till this line, it becomes easier and easier to fall into it. He found a wife that adapted fully to him. She learned language, she learned his culture, she moved to the Middle East. I'm going to end the monologue, but for my father, his problem is that he asks direct questions. And he asks them an infinite number of times because he doesn't respect your time. He doesn't respect my time. He just thinks that you'll solve the problem for him. So he never had to hear, because you will solve the problem for him after 50 questions. If you ask the same question 3 times or 30 times, eventually the other person is going to get frustrated, and they're going to stop talking. They're going to either do it for you or stop talking to you. So I think these are the 2 things. One is shutting up, listening, like literally opening your ears. You'll find that you attract people to you when you do this. You'll attract muses, people that don't speak for months, maybe they observe you. And then you'll find a creative spark that opens up the door to many more epiphanies. So I'll pause there.
Yeah, totally. And that speaks to just, I think what you're talking about is that speaks to the primacy of listening, right? Where, yeah, there's a way in which you can listen so deeply that somebody can begin to speak more deeply, right? In, you could say, the openness in which your listening takes place. I was thinking about this yesterday. I was working with a client who was with another teacher, and she was talking about, like, he's writing emails to him, that she finds herself using language in a new way when she types to him, and a way that she's really like impressed with and proud of herself afterwards. She's like, oh wow, I can't believe that I kind of came up with that. And in a certain sense, that was in the context of his sense of listening, that she literally became someone and spoke in new ways that was in some way speaking into a listening. So like listening it's not just an empty, it's never just an empty space, right? It's a generative, it generates speech. It's the space in which speech is disclosed into. In fact, I would even say, like, some of the best thinking, right, is I really learned this from Heidegger in a big way, because he talks a lot about this, that there's like this kind of this deep weddedness between listening and thought that I think the best speech comes out of where you're tuning into something, and your listening is right before what you're about to say. It's like you're listening to what is being thought right a moment, and then you speak it right after, where there's a listening and a speaking that comes via the listening, even to yourself and what you're saying, right? Of what wants to be thought. I think that's really that's where genuine thinking really comes from, is kind of like we hear what wants to be thought. We hear the glistening of an intelligibility that doesn't have words yet, but we can hear it and we can begin to bring it to speech, and we find out what it is that we think through revealing what we're hearing through our speech. I think that's the sweet spot where listening and speaking and thinking become like almost the same event. That's like flow state stuff.
Well, I can definitely relate with that, and I definitely don't want to jump on anyone who would like to add, but I actually believe that's a crutch to say that as a little, to get a little meta, but I would say that I've solved the meta crisis, the crisis of the sense-making apparatus. And I believe you've touched on it, and I resonate deeply with what you just said. If I can offer a tool that you might use in the future to convey your understanding and your listening skills, one of them is to just relay it back very simply in their own words. Literally copy their words. If you don't know what they said, literally just say verbatim what they said back to them. They'll correct you. And then if you want to get a little bit more advanced, you might say it back to them more concisely, with more concision, if you will, like a surgeon. And if you want to do even better, you'll do what I just did. Repeat yourself, use different words, different tone, and then draw an analogy, make it visceral. I just drew your mind, if you have an internal monologue, which many of you don't, to stabbing and blood. And now when you think of concise, you're going to think of blood. Maybe, perhaps not. But confusion is good too, because when you confuse people, you open their brains to programming, actually to reprogramming, because they're already in a cult, many cults. And you want them to be in cults that are productive for them and their families. And so they need sense-making apparatus. They don't have it. It's been programmed out of them. As a baby, you have this. It's literally just listening to the environment. Their ears are born open. We close them intentionally, or maybe unintentionally, but it's definitely negligence. It's definitely abuse. And what I've learned is that just literally by opening your ears, all of your senses, and listening to the environment, it tells you everything you need to know. Because people reflect back into the environment. When you speak, you hear your words. It's not for you. When I'm speaking to you, it's for me. Because I'm teaching myself how to say it better next time. I'm teaching myself what's important and what's not. And when you ask for advice sincerely, and you take advice, and you believe things with conviction, you make a statement in the environment. The environment moves around you. The environment changes. This is what the reality distortion field is. I will get to Mars by 2023. And the world says, you're crazy. It's impossible. He's been saying it for 20 years. The guy's insane. Clearly, he's believed the same thing. He's been wrong for 20 years. But in retrospect, he's always right. And this is the same thing with Trump. He's the biggest idiot who always happens to be right. But I'll pause there.
There's a quality of attunement that we've touched on too, right? Where, it's interesting. It's like there's also something that goes on below the level of speech and cognition, right? Which I think is constantly going on in relationships, which is like first came on when we learned how to speak. Like, it's interesting. We don't, like babies, don't acquire language through understanding the word that they're saying. They do it through mimicry. And I think that there's a real deep thing that goes on, that when you're paying attention to the other person while you're speaking, you're registering subtle ways in which they're paying attention, not paying attention, and your body kind of innately can begin to be present to their listening as you're speaking. It's one of the things that I noticed, what would happen to me in, like, even when I'd lead courses, and then when we were first leading courses, it's like I had never done it before, right? And there was always parts before we would start circling where I would set up the conversation by like having like doing a talk on a certain distinction or a framework or something, right, to set it up. And then sometimes it would just rock. And then other times it would just fall flat. And I was real identified with it. So I'd feel really, really bad when it fell flat, and I'd feel really good when it didn't. But like it with the same conversation, I would have the same conversation, and then one would really fly and the other one wouldn't. And for the longest time, I couldn't tell what the difference was until I started to realize like that, oh, when it went well, what was driving the conversation were the relationships and the people in the room. And that when it went badly, like was when I was when I would disconnect from the people and I'd get self-conscious, and I was so focused on what I wanted to say. And so then I started to see that distinction, and then I get in front of the room, and like what would happen is like when I saw myself kind of get like just trying to focus on what I was saying, I would bring my attention back to the people in the room, and I would just look at one person and start speaking to them. And then that just started to become more and more the way that I had conversations in front of the room with people, where it just became second nature, to where, because it's all, whenever we're speaking, where there's always a listening that's going on, and then just being attuned into the listening and allowing what I say to be in direct relationship to the listening, is I'll start to speak things that are attuned into the room and are completely relevant, right?
I just want to check in with you, Guy. It's been 2 hours now, and we're
oh wow.
I don't want to stop you if you want to keep going, but I want to be respectful of your time as well.
Oh, totally. Oh yeah, I should probably go. It's been a couple hours, but this has been great.
This has been fantastic. It's been fascinating, and we'd certainly love to have you back at any time.
I'd love to.
Yeah, and I want to draw people's attention to the Voices with Vervecki that Guy did recently with John, and he has a couple other conversations on John's channel, plus a bunch of conversations on Guy's channel. So you've had quite a bit of a back and forth with John. Some great discussions.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I'll give you. I can put up a link to my channel.
Sure. That would be great, and I can put one up too. This has been amazing. We're so grateful for your time. I think, and the interaction, just the getting in deep, and that's fantastic. Really appreciate it.
Loved it. I appreciate it. I appreciate the way that you held the space. Like I could feel your involvement, and like your leaning in and thinking new things and being interested and asking questions, and that really set a good tone for me. Thank you.
Oh, great. Thank you very much. I appreciate that. And thank you to Tyler for recording as always, and to everybody here for tuning in and participating. This such a great community that we're forming here, and each conversation seems to be getting better and better. So it's really nice to see.
Yeah, nice to meet everybody. I hope I get a chance to talk to all of you maybe here at some point.
Thank you, Guy. That was
great.
Wonderful.
Thank you, Guy, and thanks to everyone who's here.
Thank you, Guy.
Bye bye.
You're amazing.
Thanks again.